Hey guys, tonight we embark upon a solemn and curious journey through the corridors of history, where the flickering torchlight reveals truths far stranger than the fictions we have woven to comfort ourselves. As a scholar who has spent a lifetime turning the fragile pages of illuminated manuscripts and debating the nuances of theological anthropology, I invite you to set aside your modern skepticism and walk with me into the medieval mind. If you find value in this excavation of the past, do signify your presence, and let us begin our discourse. We start not in the libraries of Christendom, but in the wild heathen north, where the boundaries between man and beast were ritually dissolved by the Viking warriors known as the Berserkers. For generations, historians viewed the saga's descriptions of men biting their shields and ignoring mortal wounds as mere poetic hyperbole, a literary device to enhance the terror of the Northmen. Yet recent archaeological and botanical inquiries suggest a reality that is both more tangible and more terrifying. These were not merely angry men, but practitioners of a ritualistic fury, likely induced by the ingestion of Amanita muscaria, the psychoactive fly agaric mushroom, which contains compounds capable of inducing macropsia and dissociation, effectively severing the link between the warrior's consciousness and his physical pain. When we analyze the graves containing bear claws and wolf pelts, we are seeing the remnants of a totemic religion, where the warrior sought to channel the spirit of the predator, entering a trance state that the terrified monks of England and France could only interpret as demonic possession. It is a profound theological irony that these men who were viewed as godless barbarians were in fact deeply engaged in a spiritual technology, albeit one fueled by chemistry and bloodlust designed to shatter the psychological defenses of their enemies before a single blow was struck. From the frozen rage of the north, we must turn our gaze to the sweltering claustrophobia of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, to examine the dancing plague, a phenomenon that challenges our understanding of the human breaking point. History is often written in the ink of wars and treaties, but here it was written in the blood of blistered feet and the sweat of a delirium that seized hundreds. Frau Trophia did not step into the street to dance out of joy, but was likely driven by a combination of starvation-induced despair and the terrifying psychological pressure of a world where divine punishment felt imminent. The response of the city burghers to hire musicians and construct a stage reveals a tragic misunderstanding of the human condition, for they attempted to cure a spiritual and psychological contagion with physical exhaustion, unaware that they were merely feeding the mass psychogenic illness that had turned the city into a grim purgatory. We must look at this not just as a medical anomaly perhaps caused by ergotism from molded rye, but as a sociological scream for help from a population crushed under the weight of famine and pestilence, seeking liberation in the only expression left to them, which was the rhythmic and fatal loss of control. This tragedy of the collective will leads us inevitably to the year 1212, and the sorrowful narrative of the Children's Crusade, which stands as a testament to the dangerous power of unguided idealism. The traditional narrative of thousands of children marching to the sea expecting the waters to part is a story that breaks the heart, but the historical reality offers a more complex sociological insight into the term puri, which in the Latin of the era referred not only to children, but to the landless poor and the marginalized. It was a movement of the dispossessed, led by the charismatic Stephen of Cloyes, who believed that where the swords of knights had failed, the purity of the humble would succeed, a theological hope that was brutally deconstructed by the realities of geography and the predatory nature of the merchants, who saw these pilgrims not as holy vessels, but as human cargo destined for the slave markets of North Africa. It is a dark reflection on the era that the innocence which was meant to conquer Jerusalem became the very currency of their doom. As we delve deeper into the medieval legal mind, we encounter a concept that seems utterly alien to our modern sensibilities, which is the prosecution of animals in courts of law. One might smile at the image of a pig standing trial for murder or weevils being appointed a defense attorney. Yet we must resist the urge to mock, and instead understand the theological framework that allowed such trials to exist. To the medieval mind, the world was a unified hierarchy of creation, where every living being from the king to the insect occupied a specific place in God's order, and therefore was subject to the laws of that order. When a pig was tried in Falaise in 1386, dressed in human clothes, and executed, it was not an act of insanity, but a desperate attempt to restore the moral balance of the universe which had been disrupted by the unnatural act of an animal killing a human. These trials were an assertion of order over chaos, a declaration that justice was so universal that not even the beasts of the field were exempt from its reach, reminding us that the medieval world was one of intense legalism, where the boundaries of the law expanded to encompass the entire chain of being. We must now confront the dark iconography of the iron, made in a device that has haunted the collective imagination as the ultimate symbol of medieval barbarism, yet which stands as a monumental testament to 19th century fabrication rather than medieval jurisprudence. As a historian, it is my duty to dismantle the Gothic fantasies that the Victorians projected onto the past, for while the medieval era was certainly acquainted with the brutality of the rack and the thumbscrew, the Iron Maiden with its interior spikes and anthropomorphic dread was a sensationalist invention of a much later age, likely cobbled together to satisfy a morbid curiosity that preferred a grotesque narrative over historical truth. It is a profound historiographical irony that the device most associated with the medieval dungeon is in fact a product of the Industrial Revolution's romanticized nightmare of the past, serving only to reinforce the modern delusion of moral superiority. This tendency to underestimate the intellectual capacity of our ancestors brings us to perhaps the most pervasive and infuriating myth of all, which is the notion that the medieval mind conceived of the earth as flat. I say this with the full weight of theological and academic tradition behind me, that no educated scholar, monk, or navigator of the Middle Ages believed they resided upon a disk. We need only look to the globus cruciger, the orb surmounted by a cross held by kings and emperors, to see that the spherical nature of the world was the very symbol of Christ's dominion over the cosmos. A concept rooted in the astronomy of Ptolemy and the philosophy of Aristotle, and preserved by the likes of the Venerable Bede and Thomas Aquinas. The myth of the flat earth is a modern fiction birthed by 19th century writers like Washington Irving, who sought to elevate the figure of Columbus by inventing an ignorant opposition that never existed, effectively slandering an entire millennium of cosmological thought in service of a heroic narrative. From the architecture of the heavens, we must descend back to the gritty reality of earthly justice and the peculiar institution of trial by ordeal, which, to the modern observer, appears as nothing short of institutionalized madness, yet possessed a rigorous internal logic within the medieval worldview. When a man was forced to carry a red-hot iron or plunge his hand into boiling water, the underlying theological premise was judicium Dei, or the judgment of God based on the fervent belief that the Creator would not permit the innocent to suffer permanent harm. However, we must look beyond the miraculous and observe the psychological and sociological mechanisms at play, for the clergy who administered these trials were often less interested in divine intervention than in social resolution, often manipulating the temperature of the water or the cooling of the iron to ensure that those they deemed redeemable would pass, while using the terrifying prospect of the ordeal to coerce confessions from the guilty before the ritual even began. It was a system of justice that relied on fear and faith in equal measure, until the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, when the Church, in a move towards Roman legal rationality, forbade clergy from blessing these trials, effectively ending the practice and paving the way for the jury system. This shift from divine verdict to human judgment leads us to the figure who exists outside the law, the legendary outlaw Robin Hood, whose story has been sanitized by centuries of balladry into a noble narrative of wealth redistribution. The historical reality of the robehod is far grimmer, rooted in the court rolls of the 13th and 14th centuries, which list fugitives and violent criminals who operated in the brutal margins of society, where the forest was not a pastoral idyll, but a place of desperate survival. The early ballads do not sing of a socialist hero who charmed maidens, but of a violent yeoman who decapitated his enemies and held a deep anti-clerical grudge, a reflection of a populace weary of corrupt officials and heavy taxation. It was only later in the Tudor era that this gritty composite of forest brigand was polished into the dispossessed nobleman. We recognize today a transformation that speaks volumes about how society seeks to redeem its rebels by wrapping them in the cloak of nobility. Speaking of nobility and the misinterpretations of appearance, we arrive at the enigma of the Black Knight, a figure who in modern fantasy represents malevolence and necromancy, but in the chivalric reality of the Middle Ages was merely a matter of heraldic pragmatism. The Black Knight was not a servant of darkness, but often a warrior whose armor was painted black to prevent rust, or a noble whose livery happened to be sable, or perhaps, most famously, a reference to Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince whose martial prowess and scorched earth tactics in France earned him a reputation that required no supernatural embellishment. Thus we see that the black armor was not a uniform of evil, but a functional choice in the colorful and chaotic pageantry of feudal warfare, where identity was paramount, and the color of one's shield could determine whether one lived as a ransomable prisoner or died in the mud of the battlefield. From the battlefield, we must journey to the silent and watery wastes of the English fenlands, where the line between land and water blurs, and where the legend of Crowland Abbey rises like a stone miracle from the mist. For centuries, local folklore spoke of a great monastery built upon a swamp, a tale dismissed by many as a pious exaggeration for what rational architect would lay foundations in the muck of a bog. Yet the archaeological spade has vindicated the monastic chroniclers, revealing that the monks of St. Guthlac were not merely men of prayer, but engineers of extraordinary capability. They did not simply build upon the swamp, they conquered it, driving great piles of oak deep into the peat, and constructing causeways of gravel and clay that defied the encroaching waters, creating a sanctuary of dry land in a wilderness of damp despair. We must understand that their choice of location was not madness, but a calculated pursuit of spiritual eremia, or desert solitude, modeled after the desert fathers of Egypt, coupled with the very practical benefit that land which no one else wants is land that can be held without dispute. In their isolation, they created a thriving economy of eel fishing and scholarship, proving that the medieval monastery was a beacon of civilization, capable of taming even the most hostile of environments through a potent combination of faith and hydraulics. But if the stones of Crowland speak of endurance, the whispers of Rome speak of scandal, and the enduring enigma of Pope Joan, the woman who allegedly sat upon the throne of St. Peter. This narrative, which claims a woman disguised herself as a man, rose to the papacy, and gave birth during a procession, is one of the most contentious threads in the tapestry of church history, often dismissed as Protestant propaganda, yet appearing in chronicles as early as the 13th century. We must look closely at the seed stercoraria, the piercing chair used in papal coronations, which fueled the legend that a physical examination was required to ensure the pontiff's gender, a ritual that historians argue was symbolic, but which the popular imagination seized upon as proof of a cover-up. Whether Joan was a historical reality erased by embarrassed scribes or a satirical literary device, created to critique the corruption of the papacy, her story reveals the deep medieval anxiety regarding gender and power, and she remains a ghost that the Vatican has never fully been able to exorcise. It is this intersection of power and persecution that brings us to the specific date of Friday, the 13th of October 1307, a day that etched a permanent scar into the psyche of the West, not because of superstition, but because of the cold political machinations of King Philip IV of France. The dawn raids that seized the Knights Templar were the result of a bankrupt monarchy's envy of a military order that had become the bankers of Christendom, and the accusations of heresy and idol worship leveled against them were the prototypical show trial, fabricated to justify the seizure of assets. When the last Grandmaster Jacques de Molay burned at the stake cursing the king and Pope Clement V, he was not performing magic but uttering a prophetic condemnation of tyranny, and indeed the subsequent deaths of his tormentors within the year cemented the date in cultural memory as one of supreme misfortune, proving that the truest curses are those born of injustice. From the destruction of bodies by fire, we turn to the preservation of bodies by the art of surgery, which, contrary to the gruesome stereotype of the butcher-barber, was a discipline of surprising sophistication. We must cast aside the image of the ignorant hack and acknowledge that medieval surgeons utilizing texts like the Chirurgia Magna understood the antiseptic properties of honey and wine and performed trepanations with survival rates that would command respect even in modern operating theaters. They were not blind butchers but practitioners of a craft who navigated the humors of the body, with the tools available to them stitching wounds and setting bones with a competence that belies the term Dark Ages. Furthermore, the people they treated were not the filth-encrusted peasants of popular imagination, for the myth of the unwashed medieval commoner is largely a fabrication of the Renaissance, meant to distance the enlightened era from its predecessor. The existence of public bathhouses in cities like London and Paris, and the recipes for soap made from animal fat and ash testify that medieval people valued cleanliness as a reflection of inner purity. And while they did not possess modern plumbing, they possessed a distinct social pressure to not offend the olfactory senses of their neighbors. Finally, we return to the peculiar intersection of food and justice, with the trial by consecrated bread or the ordeal of the morsel, a liturgy of judgment where the accused was commanded to swallow piece of holy bread, based on the theological conviction that the sacred body of Christ would physically reject a liar, causing them to choke. While we might view this as superstition, it functioned as a powerful psychological truth serum, for a guilty man believing in the real presence of God in the bread would likely be so paralyzed by the fear of divine retribution that his throat would indeed constrict, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of guilt that satisfied both the court and the congregation, until the church itself recognized the danger of tempting God, and Pope Innocent III moved to ban such practices, ending the era where the bakery served as the courtroom. We now leave the chaotic courts of the secular world and retreat into the profound, terrified silence of the early morning, to witness a ritual that has been shrouded in mystery and slander for 7 centuries, the initiation of a Knight Templar. It is crucial, as we step into this sacred space, to understand that becoming a Templar was not merely joining a regiment. It was an ontological transformation, a death of the self so complete that the man who entered the chapel would effectively cease to exist, replaced by a vessel of divine will. The ceremony did not begin with the blare of trumpets or the cheering of crowds, for this was not a celebration of earthly glory, but a funeral for the worldly life. The candidate, almost always a nobleman accustomed to the deference of servants and the comfort of silk, arrived at the preceptory gates before dawn, stripped of his armor, his heraldry, and his weapons. He stood alone in the darkness, a beggar before God, waiting to be admitted not into a palace, but into a fortress of prayer and discipline. This liminal moment, standing between the sleeping world he was abandoning and the waking nightmare of holy war he was embracing, was designed to cultivate a profound humility, reminding the initiate that in the eyes of the order, his bloodline and his titles meant nothing. When the heavy gates finally creaked open, he was ushered into a chapel that bore little resemblance to the ornate cathedrals of the era. The Templar aesthetic was Cistercian in its severity: stone walls, shadows dancing in the flickering oil lamps, and an altar devoid of gold but heavy, with the relics of saints and splinters of the true cross. Here, the master of the temple awaited him, surrounded by a wall of white-mantled brothers standing in absolute silence. The interrogation that followed was not a formality, it was a trial of the soul. The master did not promise him glory or riches. Instead, he offered a grim litany of deprivations. "You will know no ease," the master would intone, his voice echoing off the cold stone. "You will be called to hunger, to thirst, and to death." The candidate was forced to confront the brutal reality of his vocation. He was surrendering his will to drink water when he desired wine, to sleep when he desired to watch, and to die in a foreign desert for a land he might never see. This was the hard test, a deliberate psychological dismantling of the knight's ego to ensure that he sought the order for salvation, not status. Upon affirming his resolve, the candidate proceeded to the swearing of the threefold vow, the monastic trinity of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We must pause to appreciate the sheer radicalism of this act for a medieval aristocrat. The vow of poverty was a total dispossession. The knight who once commanded estates now owned nothing, not even the tunic on his back, which belonged to the order. He became a poor fellow soldier of Christ, dependent on the community for his daily bread. The vow of chastity severed the dynastic lifeline that was the obsession of every noble family. He would father no heirs, carry on no name, and his lineage would end with him. A sacrifice of biological immortality for spiritual eternity. But it was the vow of obedience that was the most crushing and the most essential. In a feudal world defined by the pride of the individual warrior, the Templar swore to become an automaton of the divine will, obeying his superiors as if God himself had spoken. This was the kenosis, the self-emptying, that turned a chaotic collection of knights into the most disciplined fighting force the world had ever seen. The ritual then moved to a moment of intense physical intimacy with the sacred, the kissing of the relics. The initiate, kneeling before the altar, would press his lips to the reliquaries containing the bones of martyrs or fragments of the cross. In the medieval sacramental imagination, this was not a symbolic gesture, but a contact with the radioactive power of holiness. By touching these objects, he was physically binding himself to the communion of saints, entering into a covenant that transcended death. It was a terrifying seal, for to betray the order after such a kiss was to invite not just execution, but eternal damnation. Following this, the act of submission was formalized as the candidate knelt before the master, placing his joined hands between the master's hands, a feudal gesture of immixtio manuum utilized here to signify absolute surrender not to a lord, but to the rule of the temple. Once the vows were sealed, the atmosphere in the chapel shifted from interrogation to acceptance. The master would turn to the silent ranks of brothers and ask if there were any objections. Upon hearing none, he declared the candidate a brother. The kiss of peace that followed, the brethren embracing the new knight, was the first crack in the stern facade. A recognition that he was now part of a spiritual family that would bleed and die together. He was then invested with the iconic white mantle, the garment that signified his purity and his separation from the world. As the heavy wool was placed upon his shoulders, the master would remind him that the red cross emblazoned over his heart was a sign of martyrdom. He was wearing his own death shroud, a constant reminder that he was born to die for the faith. The ceremony concluded not with a feast, but with a communal meal of stark simplicity: bread, beans, and water, eaten in silence or to the sound of scripture. This table fellowship was the final integration, where the new brother, now clad in white, broke bread with his kin, stripping away the last vestiges of his former life. When he finally stepped out of the preceptory and into the rising sun, he was no longer the man who had stood at the gate hours before. He was a Templar, a man who had richly died to the world so that he might live entirely for God, a warrior monk forged in the dark fires of a liturgy that demanded everything. From the austere, smoke-filled chapels of the Knights Templar, where the flesh was denied in favor of the spirit, we must now descend into the sun-drenched, noisy streets of the ancient world to examine a place where the flesh was the only currency that mattered. We travel further back in time, to the year 79 AD, to the doomed city of Pompeii, where the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius performed the grim service of freezing a civilization in mid-breath. Amidst the forums, the temples to Jupiter, and the grand villas, the archaeological spade has revealed a building that speaks more honestly about the Roman condition than any senatorial speech. The lupanar. To the modern ear, the word brothel conjures images of illicit, hidden vice, tucked away in the shame-filled corners of the city. But to the Roman mind, and to the bustling economy of Pompeii, the lupanar was as essential and as visible as the bakery or the bathhouse. The very name is a lesson in linguistic sociology, derived from lupa, the Latin word for she-wolf. It frames the prostitute not merely as a worker, but as a predatory creature of the wilderness, a wolf woman who prowls for partners. Yet the architecture of the lupanar suggests that it was the men of Rome who were the true prowlers. Guided to this purpose-built factory of desire by phallic symbols carved into the very paving stones of the street, functioning like directional arrows for the libido. When we step through the narrow entrance of the lupanar, we are struck immediately by the architectural coldness of the space. This was not a boudoir of seduction, it was a hive of commerce. The ground floor is a claustrophobic corridor of small, windowless cells, each equipped with a bed made of stone. We must pause to consider the brutality of that detail. A stone bed, perhaps softened by a thin mattress of straw, but designed ultimately for durability and hygiene rather than comfort. It speaks to the Roman view of sex in this context, a biological necessity to be discharged with efficiency, a transaction as routine as buying grain. The walls above these cells offer us a remarkable and explicit window into the mechanics of the trade, adorned with erotic frescoes that have survived the fires of the volcano. Historians have long debated the function of these paintings. Were they mere decoration, titillation? The prevailing scholarly consensus suggests a more utilitarian purpose. They were a menu. In a cosmopolitan port city teeming with sailors, merchants, and slaves who spoke a dozen different tongues, these images served as a universal language of desire, allowing a client to point to a specific act without the need for shared syntax. It was the commodification of intimacy in its purest, most graphic form. But if the frescoes were the advertisements, the true soul of the lupanar is found in the graffiti scratched into the plaster by the people who lived and labored there. We often think of history as the story of emperors and generals, but here, preserved by the ash, are the voices of the invisible. We read the crude boasts of soldiers like the one who proclaimed, "I screwed many girls here," treating the wall like a ledger of conquest. We see the consumer reviews, where men praised or mocked specific women, naming them Fortunata, the lucky one, or Prima, names that were likely professional pseudonyms stripping them of their true identities. Yet, amidst the masculine bravado, we find the scratches of the women themselves, reclaiming a fragment of agency in a world that viewed them as property. These scribbles are the only autobiography these women would ever write, a testament to their existence in a society that classified them as infames, persons without social standing, legally dead in the eyes of the respectable world, yet indispensable to its functioning. This brings us to the great paradox of Roman morality, which the lupanar embodies. The Roman male was granted absolute sexual license. For a husband to visit a brothel was not a betrayal of his marriage vows, provided he did not demean his own dignity or threaten his family's lineage. The lupanar was a safety valve for the patriarchy, a place where men could indulge their appetites so that the virtue of respectable Roman matrons could remain undisturbed. It was a system built on a ruthless bifurcation of women into the Madonna and the whore, the matrona and the lupa. The brothel was therefore sanctioned, taxed, and regulated by the state, an integrated part of the urban machinery. As we stand in the ruins of this place, staring at the stone beds worn smooth by centuries of use, we are not looking at a den of sin, but at the engine room of a society that monetized human bodies with a terrifying nonchalance. The eruption of Vesuvius did not destroy the lupanar. It immortalized it, forcing us to look into the mirror of the past and see that beneath the marble grandeur of Rome lay a gritty, unvarnished reality of exploitation and desire that feels uncomfortably human. From the hedonistic stone beds of Pompeii, where desire was a coin of the realm traded with casual efficiency, we must now cross the Ionian Sea and travel back in time to the stark valley of Laconia, to witness a society where desire was strangled by duty, and where the family was ruthlessly subordinated to the monolithic authority of the state. In the city-state of Sparta, marriage was never a matter of romance, courtship, or the tender union of souls. It was a solemn, physiological contract, a mechanism of the Politia designed for a single, unyielding purpose: the production of the next generation of hoplites and mothers. Unlike Athens, where marriage was a transactional alliance between families to secure dowries and lineage, in Sparta, the silent third partner in every bed was the city itself. The Spartan state, obsessed with its own survival amidst a population of suppressed helots, viewed the womb and the phallus not as organs of pleasure, but as instruments of national defense. This utilitarian philosophy began with the very timing of the union. The state dictated that men, hardened by the brutal agoge training, should not marry until they were fully seasoned warriors of 30 years, while women were married in their prime physical years, creating a union of mature masculine discipline and robust female vitality. This was not a social custom. It was a crude form of eugenics, calculated to ensure that the seed was sown only by men who had proven they could survive the rigors of war, into women who were strong enough to bear the strain of childbirth. The ceremony itself, if one can call it that, remains one of the most jarring rituals in the ancient world, a piece of theater that stripped away every vestige of traditional femininity. On the wedding night, there were no flowing gowns, no floral garlands, and no celebratory feasts. Instead, the Spartan bride was subjected to a ritual of transformation that bordered on gender negation. Her head was shaved to the scalp, stripping away the hair that was the crowning glory of Greek female beauty. She was then dressed in a man's cloak and sandals and left alone in a dark room. This shaving of the bride has baffled historians and anthropologists for centuries. Was it a humiliation, a test of submission? I would argue it was a psychological bridge, meant to ease the groom's transition from the homosocial world of the barracks to the heterosexual world of the home. The Spartan warrior had spent his entire life surrounded by men, bonding in the mud and blood of the mess hall. To confront a woman in all her feminine otherness might have been jarring. By presenting the bride in the guise of a boy, shorn and cloaked, the ritual perhaps sought to make the strange familiar, allowing the warrior to embrace his wife as a comrade before he embraced her as a lover. It was a somber admission that in Sparta, the only identity that truly mattered was the masculine identity of the soldier, and the wife had to mimic it to be fully integrated into the polity. Following this grim preparation came the ritual of abduction. The groom would sneak away from his mess hall, locate his cloaked bride in the dark, and carry her off. This was a staged capture, a performance of dominance that reinforced the martial ethos that everything in Sparta, even a wife, must be seized by strength. But the strangeness did not end with the consummation. In a practice that defies modern comprehension, the husband did not move in with his wife. He returned that very night to the barracks to sleep alongside his fellow soldiers. For years, sometimes until the man reached the age of 30, the marriage existed in a state of clandestine secrecy. The husband would sneak out under the cover of darkness to visit his wife and return before dawn, often fathering children before the couple had ever seen each other by the light of day. Plutarch suggests this enforced separation was designed to keep the flame of desire burning bright, preventing the satiety and boredom of domestic routine, thereby ensuring that when the couple did meet, their passion, and thus the vigor of their offspring, was at its peak. However, we must also see the darker political intent. The state did not want men to become too comfortable in the domestic sphere. A man who loves his home too much might hesitate to die for the city. By keeping the warrior in the barracks, Sparta ensured that his primary loyalty remained with his brothers in arms, while the wife became a mere episode in his military existence. Yet we arrive here at the great Spartan paradox. This regime of hypermasculine control inadvertently created the most liberated and powerful women in the Greek world. Because the men were perpetually absent, living in barracks or campaigning abroad, the Spartan wife was left as the de facto master of the estate. While her Athenian sisters were secluded in the Gyneceum, weaving wool and forbidden to speak to men, the Spartan woman was managing vast agricultural lands, disciplining helots, and controlling the family finances. They became the economic backbone of the totalitarian state. Aristotle himself complained that Spartan women owned 2/5 of the land and lived lives of unrestrained luxury, a critique that reveals just how threatening this female power was to the traditional Greek patriarch. These women were not the silent, submissive ghosts of Athens. They were the mothers who told their sons to come back with their shield or on it. They accepted the state's eugenic brutality, including the inspection of newborns by the elders and the exposure of the weak on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, because they too were indoctrinated into the cult of the city. In the end, the Spartan marriage was a cold, hard diamond of a distinct social engineering, brilliant, unbreakable, and utterly devoid of softness. It reminds us that in this warrior society, there was no private life. There was only the public duty to breed, to fight, and to die, ensuring that the biological machinery of Sparta would grind on for one more generation. As we draw the heavy velvet curtain across this theater of history, we cannot simply turn away with a nod to the curious facts we have collected. To do so would be to treat the past as a mere cabinet of curiosities, a collection of dead butterflies pinned under glass for our amusement. No, we must linger here in the dim light of the library a moment longer, for the true value of history lies not in the trivia of dates and battles, but in the uncomfortable silence that follows the telling. We have traversed a vast and treacherous landscape tonight, moving from the frozen, hallucinogenic fury of the Viking North to the sun-bleached, totalitarian austerity of the Spartan South. And in every shadow, we have found not monsters but reflections of ourselves, distorted perhaps by time and desperation, but undeniably human. Reflect, if you will, on the desperate symmetry between the berserker and the Spartan. At first glance, they appear as opposites, one the avatar of pure, chemically induced chaos, a storm of wolf pelt and foaming rage, the other the paragon of rigid geometric order, a man who has shaved away his very individuality for the sake of the phalanx. Yet beneath the surface, are they not answering the same terrified question? Both societies, faced with the overwhelming fragility of life in a violent world, sought to transcend the limits of the human flesh. The Viking sought to become a beast to survive the battle. The Spartan sought to become a machine. Both rejected the soft, trembling reality of being merely a man, proving that the drive to escape our own vulnerability is the most primal of historical constants. We must also confront the arrogance of our own era. We sat here tonight and dismantled the myths of the Iron Maiden and the Flat Earth, exposing them as fictions of the 19th century. But let us be honest about why these myths persist. We cling to the idea of the Dark Ages, of a world where men believed the earth was a disk and tortured each other in spiked coffins, because it allows us to feel safe in our modernity. It comforts us to believe that we are the enlightened ones, standing atop the mountain of progress, looking down on the superstitious fools of the past. But when we look at the reality, at the sophisticated surgery of the medieval doctor, at the complex legal theology that sought to bring even a pig into the circle of justice, at the engineering genius of the monks in the swamp, that illusion of superiority shatters. We are forced to admit that our ancestors were not children stumbling in the dark. They were adults navigating a twilight with maps we have largely forgotten how to read. And what of the silent voices we have amplified tonight? The history books are often written by the victors, by the men in the high towers, but tonight we have walked in the gutter and the brothel. We have seen the women of Sparta, those fierce matriarchs who turned the absence of their husbands into an empire of female economic power, proving that even in the most patriarchal of cages, the human spirit finds a way to seize control. We have read the graffiti of the prostitutes in Pompeii, those enslaved women who etched their names into the stone to say, "I was here, I existed, I mattered." We have looked into the shadowed face of Pope Joan, a legend that, true or false, screams of a society grappling with the terrifying possibility that authority does not reside solely in the male form. These stories remind us that history is not a monolith. It is a choir, and often the most important notes are sung by those standing in the back row. Consider the terrifying logic of the trial by ordeal or the animal courts. We mock them as barbaric, yet do they not reveal a society that believed in justice so fervently that they thought the very laws of physics would bend to uphold it? They believed that water would reject a liar, that bread would choke the guilty, that God was so intimately involved in the affairs of men that he sat as a juror in every village court. Is there not something almost enviable in that terrifying faith? We, who live in a universe often described as cold and indifferent, might find a strange warmth in a world where every falling sparrow and every stolen pig was a matter of cosmic significance. So, as we extinguish the lamps and step back into our own time, let us carry with us a newfound humility. We are not the masters of history, we are merely its latest passengers. The berserker's mushroom, the Templar's vow, the Spartan's shaved head, and the dancer's bleeding feet. These are all manifestations of the eternal human struggle to find meaning in suffering, to find order in chaos, and to leave a mark that outlasts the decay of the flesh. The past is not a foreign country. It is our own home, seen through the distortion of a dirty window. As we draw the heavy velvet curtain across this theater of history and allow the dust to settle upon the artifacts we have examined tonight, we cannot simply turn away with a casual nod to the curious. Facts we have collected, for to do so would be to treat the past as a mere cabinet of curiosities, a collection of dead butterflies pinned under glass for our fleeting amusement, rather than the living, breathing and bleeding genealogy of our own souls. We must linger here in the dim light of the library, a moment longer, for the true value of history lies not in the trivia of dates and battles, nor in the recounting of strange customs, but in the uncomfortable silence that follows the telling, where we are forced to confront the reflection of our own nature in the cracked mirror of antiquity. We have traversed a vast and treacherous landscape, tonight moving from the frozen, hallucinogenic fury of the Viking North, where the boundaries between man and beast were dissolved by the chemistry of the earth, to the sun-bleached totalitarian austerity of the Spartan South, where the individual was shaved and shaped and hardened into a brick in the wall of the state, and in every shadow we have found not monsters but reflections of ourselves, distorted perhaps by time and desperation, but undeniably and achingly human. Reflect, if you will, on the desperate symmetry between the berserker and the Spartan, for at first glance they appear as diametric opposites. One, the avatar of pure chemically induced chaos, a storm of wolf pelt and foaming rage; the other, the paragon of rigid geometric order, a man who has shaved away his very individuality for the sake of the phalanx. Yet beneath the surface, are they not answering the same terrified question? Both societies faced with the overwhelming fragility of life in a violent world sought to transcend the limits of the human flesh, the Viking seeking to become a beast to survive the battle and the Spartan seeking to become a machine to survive the war, proving that the drive to escape our own vulnerability is the most primal of historical constants. We must also confront the arrogance of our own era, for we sat here tonight and dismantled the myths of the Iron Maiden and the flat earth, exposing them as fictions of the 19th century. But let us be honest about why these myths persist, for we cling to the idea of the Dark Ages, of a world where men believed the earth was a disk and tortured each other in spiked coffins, because it allows us to feel safe in our modernity. It comforts us to believe that we are the enlightened ones standing atop the mountain of progress, looking down on the superstitious fools of the past. But when we look at the reality, at the sophisticated surgery of the medieval doctor, who understood the antiseptic properties of wine and honey, at the complex legal theology that sought to bring even a pig into the circle of justice, at the engineering genius of the monks, who built cathedrals on the swamps of Crowland, that illusion of superiority shatters, and we are forced to admit that our ancestors were not children stumbling in the dark, they were adults navigating a twilight with maps. We have largely forgotten how to read, possessing a rationality that was different from ours, but no less rigorous. And what of the silent voices we have amplified tonight? The history books are often written by the victors, by the men in the high towers and the marble senates. But tonight we have walked in the gutter and the brothel. We have seen the women of Sparta, those fierce matriarchs who turned the absence of their husbands into an empire of female economic power, proving that even in the most patriarchal of cages, the human spirit finds a way to seize control. And we have read the graffiti of the prostitutes in Pompeii, those enslaved women who etched their names into the stone to say, "I was here, I existed, I mattered," leaving behind a testament more enduring than the laws of the emperors who enslaved them. We have looked into the shadowed face of Pope Joan, a legend that true or false screams of a society grappling with the terrifying possibility that authority does not reside solely in the male form, and we have seen how the collective trauma of a starving peasantry in Strasbourg could manifest as a dancing plague, a grim reminder that the mind can break in ways that defy medical explanation when the weight of the world becomes too heavy to bear. Consider the terrifying logic of the trial by ordeal, or the animal courts, which we mock as barbaric, yet do they not reveal a society that believed in justice so fervently that they thought the very laws of physics would bend to uphold it? They believed that water would reject a liar, that bread would choke the guilty, that God was so intimately involved in the affairs of men that he sat as a juror in every village court. And is there not something almost enviable in that terrifying faith compared to our own universe, which we often describe as cold and indifferent? We must recognize that the lupanar of Pompeii and the chapel of the Templars were two sides of the same coin, one a temple to the flesh, and the other a fortress against it, but both were systems of order designed to channel the unruly currents of human desire into something that could be controlled, regulated, and understood. The Templar who knelt in the pre-dawn silence to kiss the relic and renounce his name was seeking the same thing as the Spartan bride who submitted to the shaving of her head. They were seeking belonging, they were seeking a purpose that was larger than their own brief and painful lives. So as we extinguish the lamps and step back into our own time, let us carry with us a newfound humility, For we are not the masters of history. We are merely its latest passengers, and the ghosts of the past are not silent. They are merely waiting for us to learn how to listen. The berserkers mushroom, the Templars vow the Spartan's shaved head, and the dancer's bleeding feet. These are all manifestations of the eternal human struggle to find meaning in suffering, to find order in chaos, and to leave a mark that outlasts the decay of the flesh. The past is not a foreign country. It is our own home seen through the distortion of a dirty window. And it is my hope that tonight we have wiped a little of that grime away to see the faces staring back at us with eyes that are very much like our own. It is not enough to simply catalog these fragmented customs and leave them lying upon the dissecting table of history. As a theologian and a student of the human condition, I am compelled to draw the thread that binds these disparate eras together. We must linger here, in the twilight of our discourse, to examine the profound comparative anatomy of the civilizations we have traversed tonight. For when we place the silence of the Templar chapel alongside the cacophony of the Pompeian brothel, or contrast the chaotic fury of the Viking berserker with the cold, geometric precision of the Spartan marriage, a startling pattern emerges, a universal human struggle to impose order upon the terrifying chaos of existence. Consider, if you will, the dichotomy of the flesh. In Pompeii, the flesh was a commodity, something to be traded, used, and discarded with the casual indifference of commerce. The lupanar was a factory of desire, its stone beds and graphic frescoes stripping the sexual act of any sacramental weight, reducing it to a biological transaction. Yet travel forward 1,000 years to the preceptory of the Knights Templar, and we see the flesh treated not as a commodity, but as an enemy. The Templar did not sell his body, he sacrificed it. He denied it comfort, denied it lineage, and denied it safety, viewing the physical vessel as something to be burned away in the service of a higher, invisible reality. Both societies were obsessed with the body, one to indulge it, the other to transcend it, proving that whether we are Romans or Crusaders, we are forever trapped in a wrestling match with our own mortality. Then there is the matter of madness and method. We look with horror at the dancing plague of Strasbourg, seeing it as a collapse of reason. A moment where the medieval mind snapped under the weight of famine and superstition. We pity them, yet look to Sparta. Was the Spartan system any less mad? Here was a society that institutionalized the abduction of brides, that shaved the heads of women to make them resemble boys, that inspected infants like livestock, and discarded the weak into a chasm. The difference is that the madness of Strasbourg was involuntary, a scream of the collective unconscious, while the madness of Sparta was calculated, legislated, and strictly enforced by the state. The Spartans built a civilization on a foundation of sociopathic discipline and called it virtue. It forces us to ask, which is more terrifying? The chaos of the desperate dancers, or the cold, organized cruelty of the Spartan state? We must also revisit the architecture of fear. We spoke of the Iron Maiden, that spiked coffin of Victorian imagination. We now know it was a lie, a fabrication of the 19th century designed to make the medieval past look barbaric. But why did we need to invent it? Perhaps because the true terrors of the Middle Ages were too abstract, too psychological to be easily displayed in a museum. The real torture of the medieval era was not always the rack or the screw. It was the trial by ordeal, the terrifying certainty that God was watching, that the water would judge you, that the bread would choke you. The Iron Maiden is a toy compared to the psychological weight of a world where every accident, every plague, and every crop failure was interpreted as a divine indictment of your soul. The medieval man lived in a panopticon of spiritual surveillance that makes modern totalitarianism seem lenient by comparison. And what of the invisible women who have haunted our narrative tonight? History is often the story of men with swords, but tonight we have seen the shadow history of women. We saw Pope Joan, the woman who may never have existed but whose legend terrified the church for centuries, a symbol of the fear that a woman might trespass into the ultimate sanctum of male power. We saw the prostitutes of Pompeii, stripped of their names and rights, yet scratching their humanity into the walls of the lupanar. And most strikingly, we saw the Spartan wives, those paradoxes of the ancient world. While Athens locked its women away, Sparta unleashed them, not out of feminism but out of necessity. The Spartan woman was strong because the Spartan man was absent. She ruled the estate because he was enslaved to war. In every era, we see women navigating the cracks in the pavement of patriarchal power, finding ways to survive, to rule, and to be remembered. Whether through the whispers of a scandal like Joan's, or the sharp command of a Spartan mother telling her son to come home on his shield. Finally, let us consider the myth of the primitive. We began this journey by debunking the idea that our ancestors were flat earthers or unwashed savages. We end it by realizing they were sophisticated architects of their own reality. The monks of Crowland Abbey did not just pray, they engineered a city out of a swamp. The surgeons of the 13th century did not just hack limbs, they treated the brain. The Vikings did not just scream, they utilized pharmacology to alter their consciousness for battle. These were not children playing in the mud. They were men and women confronting the same eternal problems we face: hunger, war, disease, and the search for meaning, and answering them with a courage and a creativity that demands our respect. We are not the climax of history. We are merely the current chapter, and one day, future historians will look back at us, at our own myths and our own madness, with the same mix of curiosity and judgment that we now cast upon the past.